Hello, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Rowlett. And Katie, what's today's mathematical object?
Today, we're going to be talking about the Klein bottle, which I find very exciting because I am a bit of a topologist in some sense, and I'm a big fan of the Klein bottle. But we've actually brought along a special guest with us today who's been using the Klein bottle in some interesting ways and having a bit of fun with it. So, hello, Matthew Scroggs.
Hello, yeah, so I'm Matt Scroggs. I am a researcher at Cambridge University in the engineering department, and I'm also one of the editors of Chalklist magazine.
Excellent. So can you tell us, what have you been doing with the Klein bottle and how did that start?
Yeah, so I programmed a game that I call Asteroids. So this game is based on the game of Asteroids, and you'll remember that if in the game of Asteroids, if you go off the top, you magically come back on the bottom of the screen. And if you go off the left, you come back on the right of the screen. And I've been playing about with those rules of like what happens when you go off the side of the screen to make games on different surfaces.
Interesting. I mean, like my canonical reference for this, like I know that there may exist people, I'm not completely sure, but there may exist people who don't remember Asteroids, which is the saddest thing ever. My other reference for this would be the game Snake on the Nokia 3210, of course, which was also similarly like a little tiny screen, but you could go off the side and come back on the other side and go off the top and come back on the bottom.
Yeah, and actually it wraps in exactly the same way as Asteroids.
And that's a fab modern reference for the
Absolutely,
kids.
Yeah, that's what all the kids are doing these days. There must be something around now. Like, does Angry Birds do that? I don't know. Probably not.
No, so the Final Fantasy games on the PlayStation 1 did that, but ever since they became more 3D, they haven't done that kind of wrapping. Typically, in most modern games, you get really large worlds which have like an edge of the map and you can't go any further. Or it's just sea onwards, and so you don't get so much wrapping anymore.
It's a sort of weird, unnatural thing, isn't it? That you sort of... You disappear over there and you appear over there is just odd.
Yeah.
It's slightly weird to get your head
I guess
around.
it came from the fact that in the earliest video games you couldn't get the screen to scroll because it would take too much memory. So to make the game feel larger, you'd have to add some sort of wrapping to make it not feel like you're in a small enclosed area.
Yeah. I think part of the thing about Asteroids was that was part of the gameplay, that you could kind of like go off near the corner and come back on, and like it would... You know, you could turn around and shoot something that was off the screen and that kind of thing. Like it was part of it that it was that kind of small universe, and if you got your head around how it connected up, you could actually make use of that.
Yeah. So how are we saying this works? Is this weird teleportation that happens at one side of the screen to the other?
So you could imagine it being weird teleportation, or you could imagine that actually it means that it's not really a 2D game, but there's some sort of implied surface going on. So the easiest way I think to imagine this is to start by thinking about Pacman.
As I often am, almost though. I'm literally wearing a Pacman t-shirt right now.
Yeah, it's an impressive choice for this episode. So yeah, the Pacman is slightly simpler because Pacman there's only one wrapping around. So you'll know that in Pacman, if you go around the maze, there is the weird pathway heading off to the right of the screen, and if you go off that, you come back on the left of the screen. And you don't use this very often because it doesn't have any pack dots on it, but sometimes you might use it to get away from the ghosts. And so with Pacman, you could kind of imagine that Pacman is sort of going through a teleporter and then coming back on magically the other side. But actually, it's nicer to imagine that if you kind of lift the maze off the screen and wrap it round, you get a cylinder. So actually, rather than Pacman magically teleporting, he's just walking around the outside of a cylinder.
Is it worth at this point mentioning the game Lemmings Revolution? Which literally no one ever played, but it was a Lemmings game that was a 3D game rendered on a cylinder, and the Lemmings could walk all the way around the cylinder. Did no one else notice this happen?
I did not know that was real, or I would have written extensively about it.
It genuinely was a game, and it was like the original Lemmings game, except that it was wrapped around a cylinder. Did I imagine this? I don't know. My husband is nodding. It is a real game.
Okay,
he remembers it.
I'm going to download that this afternoon and work out how to play that.
So that's actually a thing in topology, right? So if you've got a square, say, for instance, you can you can basically glue together the edges of a square, which in a 3D physical sense would physically give you a cylinder. But the notion in topology is that you're identifying the two edges. So you're saying this edge equals this edge in a mathematical sense. And therefore, if you go off this side, you come back on this side because they are the same thing. There's like a notation for it. Like you draw a little arrow on each edge, and it kind of it tells you that they're glued. Like, topologists use the word glued to describe this, because it literally is just like picking up the whole thing and sticking it together.
Yeah, and it's so for Pacman, it's typical to imagine as well that the two edges are directed in the same direction. But actually, it could be that Pacman was actually taking place on a Mobius strip, because you can imagine that as you wrap it around, you could put a twist in it. And because Pacman is symmetric, he looks the same if you turn him upside down, you couldn't actually tell if he went off one side and came back on upside down. Although I guess the controls would probably have to reverse.
Oh my god! I'd never thought of this. Yeah, if he turns left, he would be kind of turning right, I guess.
I guess the controls could always be relative to where you're currently sitting. It could kind of make sense that Pacman could actually be on a Mobius strip.
That's incredible. Non-orientable Pacman.
And this is yes, you can't tell because Pacman can only go off at one position. So there's no kind of Y coordinate that you can
it's
make.
in the middle. Yeah.
So this is where Asteroids becomes more interesting, because you can go off the side at any position. So if you in this one that Asteroids cannot be on the equivalent of a Mobius strip, because if you go off near the top of the left-hand side, you come back on near the top of the right-hand side. So it must be directed in the same direction.
Whereas Pacman, was it because it was in the middle
Yes.
that you couldn't tell?
Although I guess if it was higher up, you could still wrap from higher up to higher up, and it would just be offset a bit.
Yeah. Are there any Pacman levels with more than one? Is it always just the same layout?
In the original, yes. In Ms. Pacman, there might be more levels, so maybe some of those are definitely on. I feel like I would know if there was one where you switched which thing you went off, but that's going to prompt further research.
Yeah. So this is kind of left to right is explained by the fact that it's a cylinder.
Yeah.
But in Asteroids, you've also got top and bottom. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so in that case, you can imagine, again, if you kind of lift the Asteroids level off the screen, you could start by doing the same thing with Pacman and wrapping around left to right to get a cylinder. But also, you now need to make the top of the cylinder and the bottom of the cylinder match up. So you can imagine kind of stretching them round, and you're going to get a donut-like shape or a torus.
Yeah. So this is the sort of topology thing. If you draw a pair of arrows on the sides and a different pair of arrows on the top and bottom, you do get a torus shape. And it's like a really fundamental object in topology. Everyone loves toruses. Toruses are great. But yeah, this kind of seems not intuitive. Like, if I ask people what it means if when you go off the left you come on the right and when you go on the top you come on the bottom, they often say, oh, it means you're on a sphere. Obviously. And I'm like, well... Yeah,
actually, it's a mistake they made in Final Fantasy VIII. They had a world map that looked like this, but they represent it with a picture of a sphere. Because they obviously hadn't thought that deeply about actually what the kind of surface they were implying.
Yeah, it sort of feels intuitive that it's a sphere, because that would happen. Like, if you're standing on a sphere, just imagine for a second that you're standing on a gigantic sphere, if you can possibly imagine that. Spoilers, you are. It's the Earth. But you could kind of go off and go all the way around the back of the Earth and come back on. And you could also go off and go all around, like, through the North Pole and through the South Pole and back to where you are. But that's not quite how it works, because the immediacy of, like in Asteroids, you go off, you're immediately on the other side. So what you're actually saying is the patch you're looking at stretches around the whole thing. And if you do that on the Earth and you join up the left and right edges, there isn't really a way to get to the top and bottom edges. Sort of, it doesn't quite match up properly, because spheres are weird. They've got different geometry, so... Because
sort of there are shorter lines of latitude.
Yeah, I think it's about Gaussian curvature, just to throw in some more maths here. Because, like, if you've got a piece of paper, you can roll that into a cylinder easily. But then rolling it into a torus, if you've got an actual physical piece of paper, is a bit harder because of the Gaussian curvature of a flat plane. But on a sphere, you've got this property where it curves in two directions at the same time, which a piece of paper generally can't do unless you're prepared to destroy it. So the nature of a sphere is completely different, I guess, than a flat plane in certain ways. There is a way to identify up a square to make a sphere, but it's not by identifying top and bottom and left and right. I think you sort of do like adjacent edges and you get kind of a cone thing, and it's sort of weird. But I mean, that's another game, I guess.
Yeah, that can work. You can also kind of, if you imagine more like the world map, if you attach the left and right sides and then kind of attach half the top to the other half of the top. Because on the world map, if you actually walk off the top, you come back on somewhere else on the top, because the whole of the top is the North Pole.
Of course, yeah. So if you'd made a cylinder and then just squashed the top and bottom of the cylinder flat and stuck it together, yeah.
That's topologically a sphere.
So it sounds like there are more interesting things we can do with this identifying. So we've got wrapping it round into a cylinder, we've got wrapping it round into a cylinder, wrapping that round into a torus, and we've got putting a twist, so we wrap it round kind of with a twist. And I guess there are probably people thinking, what if you do both of those things? Like if you do a twisted torus, is that a thing?
Yeah, so that's where today's object, the Klein bottle, comes from. So this is if you take left and right and put one of them upside down and leave top and bottom in the same direction. So that's sort of, you can imagine folding over top to bottom first, you get a cylinder, then you need to connect the ends of the cylinder, except you need to put a sort of twist in them. Except a normal twist won't happen, because if you imagine twisting two cylinders, you're not going to reverse the direction of one of the edges. So you sort of have to put one end of the cylinder inside the other cylinder and then connect them up kind of the other way around.
Yeah, so there's a very, very standard animation on Wikipedia that someone made like years and years ago that kind of shows a tube that sort of punches a hole through the side of itself with the bottom end of the tube, and then it kind of connects upwards from inside. And I always think of this, like I usually, what I do if I try and explain this to someone is I get a slinky, because the thing about a slinky is it is a cylinder and it's also quite flexible, so you can use it to make a torus shape. But if you're doing that, if you imagine you're holding the two ends of a slinky making a torus, if you take one of them and turn it 180 degrees over, they're both pointing the same direction, and then you can just kind of slide the two halves of the slinky through each other, because they're all kind of like, it's just a series of spirals, so they kind of slot together such that the two ends of the slinky are in exactly the same spot, but they're now the opposite way around. They're in the opposite orientation, and you get this sort of thing that intersects itself, and it's sort of a weird bottle shape. That's where the name comes from.
You end up with both ends of the slinky kind of both pointing in the same direction, both pointing up or whatever, but kind of intersecting in the same space.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is my favourite way to visualise how a Klein bottle works, because you can really see that these two things have been, like, you've literally turned it over in the same way that when you make a Mobius band, you physically turn over the piece of paper to stick it down. But you can't do that without it intersecting. And this is one of the things about a Klein bottle, that it is not an object that happily exists in three-dimensional space, because it has to intersect itself. And most well-behaved objects don't tend to do that. Like a sphere just sits there quite happily in 3 dimensions, but the Klein bottle works okay in 4 dimensions, but doesn't necessarily in 3 dimensions. It's got this kind of self-intersection.
So today, when we publish these episodes, we put a picture on the post. If you go to a4article.com, you can find the pictures for each episode. And the picture that we've got today is your glass Klein bottle.
Yeah.
That's not a thing, right?
It's sort of not a thing. The best way to think of it is that it is the shadow of a Klein bottle. So if you've got a 3-dimensional object casting a 2-dimensional shadow, which is conventionally what happens, if your 3D object is in any way complicated, like a knot in a piece of string or something, the shadow will self-intersect. Like if it's a piece of string tied in a knot, your shadow will be a line that crosses itself in a couple of places. And you can't avoid that, because by projecting down a dimension, you kind of lose some information. You lose whether it's gone in front or behind, I guess, is the information you lose. And in the same sense, a 3D Klein bottle, like a 3D implementation of a Klein bottle, I guess, it's an embedding, is the shadow of a 4D object in 3D. So it passes through itself.
I've seen you do this demo where you've stood in front of a projector, so there's a bright light with your shadow on the wall behind you, and then you put your hand either behind your head or in front of your face, and in the shadow we can't tell which you've done.
Yeah.
Because the shadow just flattens out that information.
Yeah, so it's kind of the fact that it's 4-dimensional. Obviously, we're already struggling here because we're trying to describe physical objects using a podcast, but also 4 dimensions is really quite hard to visualize anyway, even if you've got something in front of you. But it's this idea that there's more information there than we can capture and perceive in our kind of 3D universe with our limited 3D brains that are used to only 3 dimensions. So it's kind of a more complicated shape than we can conceive of, but if we look at it with our 3D eyes, we get this sort of thing that crosses through itself. And in 4D, it just connects round quite happily. And I'm sort of miming that, but that's nonsense, because I'm miming it in 3D, so that doesn't make any sense. But yeah,
it just goes around in the 4th dimension. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, it's a very cool shape.
So this glass Klein bottle, which actually I have a feeling all 3 of us own one, I do, I think.
Doesn't everyone?
Is basically a 3D drawing of a four-dimensional object, essentially.
Yeah, it's at that point where you realise that actually this thing that you think of as a 3D object isn't quite capturing all the information in the way that a 2D drawing doesn't quite capture all the information on a 3D object. That suddenly makes you feel quite limited as a being. Like, oh no, my existence is meaningless. No, it's okay. But yeah, so it's a very cool object, and my top fact about the Klein bottle, which may become relevant to playing games, is that if you cut a Klein bottle in half, you get 2 Mobius bands. But if you cut a Klein bottle in half in a different direction, you get 1 Mobius band. Which is kind of a ridiculous fact about this thing. But if you think about it as the identification space, so you've essentially got a square, you've glued together 2 of the edges with the same orientation and the other 2 edges with a different orientation. It corresponds to different lines you can draw across that square. And if you do it one way, you get one thing, because the twist means that the 2 bits that you leave are still connected to each other. And if you do it between 2 other points, the 2 bits that you get are disconnected because there isn't a twist in that direction. So that's a fun one to play with if you've got a pen and paper handy.
Oh yes, I guess you can see that from the Asteroids game I made, which you can play on a Klein bottle. On that one, I've made left and right are switched up and down, and top and bottom are the same direction. So if you aim kind of directly upwards and keep flying upwards, you're going to kind of go in a loop. But if you go left to right, so if you imagine kind of cutting it straight down, you're going to get 2 things that look like loops. Mm. But if you cut it horizontally and you fly off one side, you come back on the bottom of the other part. So you're going to get 1 loop if you cut it horizontally. Yeah,
if you don't touch anything and just keep flying straight forward, you'll go across the bottom, and then you'll come back and go across the top, and then you'll come back and go across the bottom again.
Which doesn't happen if you go up and down. That's
weird. Yeah, I think the one to get 1 Mobius band is maybe like a diagonal somehow. I can't remember exactly, but it's a fun puzzle to work out.
The way I imagine it going straight down, I think you get 2 cylinders.
Yeah, you can also do that if you've got a Klein bottle. You can cut it and get... It's just ridiculous. Although I don't know if they'd be cylinders because the ends of them are identified. Maybe that is how you get one.
Oh, no, I guess, so I imagine kind of just cutting where the end's identified. Obviously, you get back to a cylinder. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for people listening...
we're just having fun.
This conversation is involving a lot of arm waving and a certain amount of sort of looking puzzled into the distance. So if that's how you're feeling listening to it, then that's perfectly authentic.
Yeah, you're welcome to wave your arms along at home.
But thankfully, surely Klein bottle, this cylinder with a twist in it, is surely as complicated as it gets, right?
So no. So actually, you can take it a little bit further, because we said we start with a torus, and we've switched the left and right to be the opposite direction. But of course, we could also switch the top and bottom to also be in opposite directions. And this is another level you can play on Asteroids. And this is actually one of the hardest ones to play, because if you fly off towards a corner, if you imagine kind of just missing the corner, you go off the left and come back on the right, but upside down. Then immediately go off the bottom and come back on the top, but upside down. And you end up... Hang on, I've explained that really badly. I've confused myself.
The impression I'm getting here is it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. So anyway, if you fly into a corner, you end up coming straight back out the same corner.
Yeah,
because I think you go off the sides that fire you straight back into the other sides, and you come straight back from where you came from.
Yeah, so there'll be 2 corners that have that property, and there'll be 2 corners that do something slightly different, I guess, because there's 2 where the arrows are pointing towards the corner and 2 where they're away. I can't remember.
No, so I think they all do the same thing, because it doesn't matter if you're pointing towards or away.
Yeah, they'll always have... Hang on, I'm trying to draw some arrows on a square in my mind now, but I've only got 1 pair of hands, so I can only do 2 at once. Hang on. Yeah, they will sort of behave in the same way, because, they're just flipping you to the other side is all they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, you could, if I haven't programmed friendly fire on Asteroids, but if I had, you could sit near the corner, shoot, and you'd destroy yourself.
Nice. Yeah, that was always one of the annoying things about Asteroids, because if you shoot and it goes off and comes back on the other side, it will hit you. So you got to kind of get out of your own way in some ways as well. But yeah, this just makes it worse, because there are now directions that you could do that in that didn't work for that before.
Yeah.
If you start right in the middle, there's now 8 directions you can shoot yourself in. Excellent.
So I guess we should talk about what shape that makes as well. So as well as just connecting it up, we can think about what shape it makes. So my 4D imagination breaks at this point, and I haven't got a good image for how it makes what it makes.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's a thing called the real projective plane, which has a very important mathematical meaning and is a very useful space that models lots of things. But it is a bit of a nightmare to imagine. So the main idea of a real projective plane, and because this is all in this sort of topology universe where things can be stretched and squashed, so it doesn't matter exactly what shape something is. Like if you've got a Klein bottle, it could be a cylinder that's been passed through itself, or it could be a cylinder that's much thinner at one end, or whatever, but it still counts as a Klein bottle. So the real projective plane can be thought of as if you take every point on the surface of a sphere and glue it to the point directly opposite itself on the sphere. Which works fine for, like, you can imagine one hemisphere you could glue onto the other hemisphere just by kind of, standing on a football and squashing it in. But you then also have to do all the other points as well, kind of to the point directly opposite them. So you kind of end up with a thing that sort of sticks to itself through itself. Like the whole thing just sort of collapses in and goes, and it's some stuff. But the reason for this is that what it essentially boils down to is that every direction that you can pass through the centre point of the sphere in is a point in this space, because it consists of the 2 opposite points on the sphere. So the real projective plane is a very useful thing for mathematicians, because any arrow direction that a vector could be pointing in is a point in this space. So it kind of models lots of things usefully. Another way to think about it is, like another equivalent structure, is if you take a sphere, cut a hole in the front of it, and then take a Mobius band which has got one edge and glue the one edge of the Mobius band along the edge of the hole that you've just made. Which again, you can't do without it intersecting itself, because the Mobius band's got one edge which wraps around itself twice, so the whole thing has to sort of stick in the hole. And the conventional way of drawing this is to draw a circle on the front of the sphere and then draw just like an asterisk that crosses through the circle, so there's like 3 lines pointing in different directions, which if you actually draw that, you're basically just drawing the Death Star from Star Wars, which is one of my favourite ways to represent the real projective plane, just is the Death Star. But you get this thing, and I know people have done like a real projective plane handbag where you get a piece of fabric and it does have to kind of have a slot in the fabric where it passes through itself, but it's actually quite a nice, like, it doesn't contain any volume because it's weird and 4-dimensional and horrific, but in practice you can actually put your phone in it, so it does work as a handbag, but it's not like, it doesn't have a sealed internal bit, like you just sort of have to go through the folds of fabric and that's what keeps everything in. But it's pretty cool. So I guess what most people at home will be thinking is, how do I get to play these games? Because you've obviously built a load of different versions of Asteroids. How do we play Asteroids?
Yeah, so it's definitely worth playing them as well, because you can really visualize what's going on a lot better if you play about on these surfaces yourself to kind of get an idea of how these things interconnect. So if you go to my website, mscroggs.co.uk/asteroids, you'll find it there and you can just play it online.
Cool, fantastic. And can we find you on Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at mscroggs.
And do you by any chance write for any magazines for the mathematically curious?
Yes, in fact, I edit a magazine for the mathematically curious. So you can find that online at chalklessmagazine.com or on Twitter at chalklessmag.
Excellent. I am also on Twitter at Stex.
And I'm at Peter Rowlett, and the podcast itself is at MathsObject.
And both Peter and I blog at aperiodical.com, which is where you can find more episodes of this podcast.
And if you want to email us and suggest an object or express your confusion about topological spaces, then you can email us objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.